Welcome to the Talent Equation Podcast. If you are passionate about helping young people to unleash their potential and want to find ways to do that better, then you've come to the right place. The Talent Equation Podcast seeks to answer the important questions facing parents, coaches, and talent developers as they try to help young people become the best they can be. This is a series of unscripted, unpolished conversations between people at the razor's edge of the talent community who are prepared to share their knowledge, experiences, and challenges in an effort to help others get better faster. Listen, reflect, and don't forget to join the discussion at thetalentequation.co.uk. Enjoy the show.
I'm really pleased to welcome Jack Walton on the podcast. Jack, I'm quite indebted to actually because in one of the early days of my podcasting adventure, I had a couple of issues where I had some really bad sound quality, and Jack came to the rescue and actually went over and above in helping me with the sound, because he actually went and gave me a video and showed me actually how to do it and everything else, which was absolutely fantastic. So, Jack, you were part of my apprenticeship as a sound engineer since I started podcasting. So, really, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, and good to know that it's had some use. I can't take all the credit though. It was an online course I took to try and make my own DJ mixes sound a little bit better back in the day, and I thought that some of it might apply to helping you fix your own audio, so hopefully that's been of help.
Well, this is like, peer-to-peer learning. It's what the whole thing's about, isn't it? So anyway, Jack, great to have you on. I wonder if you could basically just share your story with everybody, tell everybody about your background and kind of what you get up to, and sort of what your day-to-day in this crazy world we call coaching is all about.
Okay, yeah, so there's not a typical day or week, really, I suppose. Day job, coach development manager for the FA, covering the Northwest region. What that typically means is helping coaches to get better, or helping those who coach or tutor the coaches to get better. So look after a team of full-time coach developers up in the Northwest here, and then we take responsibility for formal, informal, and non-formal coach learning and development, I suppose. That's the day job. And then as far as a volunteer coach goes, help out at a local grassroots club in Liverpool, where I live. Currently work with a group of under-14s boys who really lucky and privileged to work with. They're an absolutely fantastic bunch. I've been working with them, many of them, since they were about 9 years old now. So we've come on quite a long-term journey together.
It fascinates me to watch them, to just sort of see them year on year, because what's funny is between seasons they grow and they come back and you're like, blimey, where have you come from?
Absolutely, yeah. We've got a few that have gone through that in the last couple of summers, where haven't seen them for 6 to 8 weeks, and it's like you do a double take and they've grown a matter of inches, and all the problems that brings with it. And yeah, so it's understanding that long-term process, that it's never really a smooth ride for them, especially when they're in the throes of adolescence.
And the personality shifts and everything else. So as a starting point for this conversation, we were chatting on Twitter and sort of bouncing a few ideas around, and so I think we first met, and I don't 100% remember this because I did an awful lot of these sessions, but I was at the time working for Sports Coach UK, and I was their lead for talent, and I used to travel the country doing what we call talent breakfast clubs, where we would get groups of coaches from different sports, which was a bit of a first, working in the talent space, to come together early in the morning, bleary-eyed, cup of coffee, bacon roll if you're lucky, or if you're not lucky, you get the fruit and the croissants, which people didn't like. And we used to, I used to do a bit of a presentation as a starting point, and then we'd have a bit of a conversation. And by all accounts, you gave me a hard time, which I don't remember, so it can't be that hard, but I think that might be a good starting point to go on your reflections from.
Bars, I've dug out my old notepad from back then. It was actually the 22nd of February 2012 when I was about 2 or 3 months into my role at the FA. And I was actually off to the States that afternoon, and it just happened. I was living in Bristol. The Breakfast Club was in Bath. I had the most awful journey ever. What should have been 20 minutes was an hour and a half. I rocked in just as you were starting, managed to grab the last bacon butty, and I think you kicked off with a discussion about nature nurture. I think you put a sliding scale on the floor and said, right, position yourself. Where do you sit? I think the window was nature and the door was nurture, and I think I started to walk out of the door and ended up in the car park before you stopped me. I'm ashamed to say, but I was there's a lot of water passed under the bridge since then, and I've changed my mind about quite a few things, but I was very ashamed to say it, quite dogmatic, and I think I did give you a bit of a hard time that day.
Remind me then, so what you were 100% in the nurture camp, were you?
Yeah, I probably just read too many well-written books that didn't really address both sides of the argument. And yeah, I think I threw the Polgar sisters at you as an example of, well, it's just all about nurture, surely, if they can become chess champions and so on. And yeah, I think I was very much in that camp at that point. Ashamed to say, to be honest.
Well, I wouldn't be too ashamed because I think I was pretty much there with you. I mean, I was making the case for, and I still do, and funnily enough, I still do that nurture nature thing. I did it the other day. And it's because it's sort of, but what I've started to do now is I've gamified it more. So for the listeners, I basically ask people to sort of go on one side of the room, whether they're a naturist, not that kind of naturist, or they're a nurturer, and I ask them to sort of put themselves on a sliding scale as to whether they're in the nurture nature camp, just to sort of see where people are, and then we have a discussion about where people sort of. And what I now do though is I change the rules, so I put the rules whereby you can't be on a sliding scale anymore. You have to be in one camp or the other, and I begin that debate, and people hate that. And then the other one is I do as well is I say, right, you've got. You hold the purse strings for all of UK sports performance money, and you've got a choice between investing in environments and coaches or investing in genetic testing and physiological mechanisms to identify the kind of best athletes, which way you're going to place your bet, where you're going to put all your money, and that stimulates some other interesting debates. But definitely at that time, though, I was, and probably still to a certain extent, one of the things I'm making the case for is the role of environments and the role of coaches. And obviously, we both work in that space, so it's no surprise that we would go down that track. But I'm interested as to why you now think, sort of, you're less convinced of your original argument.
Yeah, I think that the problem stems from, and it's probably wider than just in sports and coaching. It's this kind of reductionist view of things. So coaching or human learning and development, what I've learned is a really complex thing, and I think just getting my head around what the term complex actually means was a starter. So the difference between complex, complicated and simple, for example. So complex, what works for one doesn't necessarily work for another. And I suppose it's a little bit like the weather. Saying, well, what determines the weather? Oh, well, it's just the wind, or it's the air temperature, or the pressure. Or actually, it's a number of different factors combining with or against one another that determines that. And so I think that the reason I've changed my mind on it is just to stop being so simplistic about things and say that we're talking about trying to help players to reach their full potential. It's not an either or argument of whether it's nature nurture. Let's just think of it as 100% both. Then we take that argument off the table and let's look at what can we actually control. I think I saw a great quote. It might have actually been from John O'Sullivan at some point. I know you've had on before, which is the genes loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger. And that's something I've kind of just learned to relax about it and just look at controlling and what we can control, and not getting too hung up on the rest of the things that we can't.
Yeah, I think that's usually that's sort of where I try and get people to in terms of the conversation around nurture nature and sort of genes versus environment, if you like, is that the idea of versus, or it's one or the other, or one's more important than the other, is kind of a non-argument, because it's about the dynamic interaction between the two. And one of the messages I try and convey within that conversation is that actually the idea that your genetic makeup is fixed, and therefore that's kind of what you've got, and then the idea is to make the most of what it is you've got is actually not really an accurate assessment, and there aren't any real serious geneticists that think that anymore. It's more the environment actually can play quite a significant role in changing our the way our genes express, and the best way I like to think of it is, instead of them being like switches that are either switched on or switched off, they're like a volume knob that can be turned up or turned down, and different environmental stimulus can make different changes to people's sort of genetic makeup. I mean, to a lesser or greater extent, and it's still an area that we're exploring. But yeah, I kind of I've arrived at that position myself. But for me, one of the reasons that's important to understand is, like you said, the bit we can control is the environment where the development takes place. So actually, that's the bit we should focus on, because everything else will sort of level itself out in time.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that was interesting that you used the sound analogy again. You're on my wavelength there. I'm not doing a Nick and trying to get in film titles, by the way. So just we'll get that on the table. But I think that came to me. It was a book, really well written by a guy called Matt Ridley, called Nature via Nurture, which I'd recommend if people are interested in this sort of thing. Which again goes along with what you were saying there about, rather than on off, it's just to what extent and how much that environment plays a role in shaping our development as people.
Brilliant stuff. I'll definitely be looking that one up. Funnily enough, while we're sharing books, I've just finished an absolutely amazing book, one of the best I've ever read, called The Gene: An Intimate History, by a guy called Siddhartha Mukherjee, who's actually an oncologist, a cancer physician, and he tells some amazing stories about the nature of genetics and how it's moved on in right from the history of it and all the way through eugenics and everything else, and it's genuinely fascinating. But throughout the book, it comes back to this point of, and actually in real detail, actually starts to really delve into basically what it is to be human, and how environments and heredity and all these sorts of different things go up, and some of the breakthroughs they're on the verge of making around actually physically manipulating genes. And we do it now. I mean, there are genetically modified humans walking around this earth. I didn't realize this. And we're capable of it. It's just, there's obviously ethical dimensions and things to unravel. But before long, we will genuinely be able to. So he uses this phrase, which I really love. He said, "We are one of the only species on the planet. In fact, we are the only species on the planet that have learned to read our own instructions and rewrite them." Yeah,
it's that definitely sounds like one for my never-ending Kindle list. And funny you should say, I took the I don't know if you heard of 23andMe. It got me interested. So I took that about 15 months ago now, I would say, and it was absolutely fascinating looking at the results back. And the scary bit was that my genetic code was I could download it into a text file, millions and millions of lines long, and I thought, I wonder what you could do with that in the future. It'd make it definitely plenty of room for an upgrade, I would have thought.
It's funny because it kind of, a part of me's thought about doing something similar, but a part of me would also not 100% don't know if I want to know.
Yeah, well, I opted into the health markers, and I found out some interesting stuff from which I've made some changes, and I would rather have 30 years to do something about it than hit 60 years old and be presented with something that I thought, I wish I'd done something about that.
Yeah, I think that's very wise, and actually maybe you've changed my mind. Maybe I do need to have a think. Anyway, let's shift off genes, because I could go down that rabbit hole with you for a long time. But just sort of coming back to the sort of stuff that you're doing day to day, both as a coach developer and as a coach, and just kind of interested in what are the challenges that you're facing, what are the things that you're seeing, what are the things that you think are kind of, I suppose, hot topics for us to try and tackle while we're in this space talking to each other and sharing our ideas with others?
Yeah, well, I suppose the challenge is I try to have an empathy with the coaches I work with. So the vast majority of coaches that I see in my day job are volunteers, often mums or dads or young, keen people who are trying to maybe forge a career in coaching, but they all share some commonalities, and that's generally lack of time, not much or often facility constraints, and they're dealing in this grassroots environment where they're dealing with a wide range of abilities, with a wide range of motives for being there. So they're having to deal with quite a lot, and I'm exactly the same in the grassroots context in which I coach. So try to have that empathy with them and help them to become the best coach that they can be, or to develop, their own players that they're fortunate enough to work with. So really getting on that, seeking to get an understanding of them first, and they all have their own unique problems, but there's often a lot of commonalities as well, which I just mentioned.
So I sometimes I'm a bit provocative when it comes to the world of coaching, and quite often I'll be found on Twitter sort of challenging the community and sort of challenging some of our methods and approaches and this, that, and the other. And I do so more often than not just to stimulate the debate. Sometimes it's also to make people stop and think. And again, this is another quote from this book I've just read. He says, you need counterculture to counterculture. And what I take from that is sometimes you need to take a deliberately kind of definitive stance and say, it's not this, it's this, in order to get people to consider that it might not be this, it might be something else. And so I get a lot of criticism. People say, well, it depends. Yes, of course it depends. But actually, why don't we have a conversation about this for a little while and explore it? And then we can decide where we were and what we were doing should be different or not. So I'm interested just to sort of get your stance on this whole debate around the way we should be working, when we're working with community coaches, and how we should be tackling some of the challenges that they face and all those sorts of things.
Recently, my thinking has become that we're living in the information age, and we can't escape from that. And there's plenty of positives and drawbacks, I suppose. So there's masses and masses of information out there. You could almost get the answer to any question from any point in human history within a few seconds, and that's a really weird world that we're living in. It's certainly not one that we've evolved in. And so I think that key skills that a coach within the information age requires is the ability to think critically and reflect critically. And what I mean by that is that that critical thinking. So a coach might go on the internet and just think, what am I going to do tonight? And so an example would be, and this is a true story, a coach who has gone on YouTube and looked at Barcelona's first team training session, and it was a drill designed to what the outcome of that drill I don't know, because I haven't spoken to the coach, but let's just say it looked pretty good, as you could imagine, with Barcelona's first team. And then that coach has then got frustrated because he's tried to apply that into the context in which he works, which is grassroots under sevens, and has then got frustrated. So yeah, I think that ability to think critically about why you're doing what you're doing, and to actually hold an opposing argument in your head at the same time is something that's really important, because we tend to only think critically about stuff that we disagree with. So I'm currently trying to, in my own practice, and get other coaches to actually pick holes in your own beliefs, and how would you attack them? And if they still hold true, then great. But try and just challenge your own beliefs. And that can be quite uncomfortable at times, but I think it's an important process to go through.
I think you're absolutely right, but you've actually just made me think of your podcast, because we're fellow podcasters, and I will plug your podcast, because I've only just discovered it. So it's called the Liverpool FA podcast. Is that right?
Yeah, well, it's not personally mine. I just happen to be the one that's recorded the episodes so far, but it's the County FA that I support in my day job, Liverpool County FA. They've kindly agreed to try this and see how we can engage with volunteers in another medium, and it seems to be going well so far.
Brilliant. Well, I would certainly attest to that, because I was listening with great interest. You happen to have one of my friends in coach development on the episode I was listening to, Don Vincent, who I do intend to get on the show as soon as we can make our schedules align. But in that conversation, you were talking, and Don was talking particularly about having a coaching philosophy or a series of principles. And you've just used the word beliefs. I mean, these are all words I think that we're using to describe around kind of what Don described as, just how we act. What is the fundamental basis of how we act as a coach? What is it that we can use in order to give us some consistency of action, as opposed to being changing all the time? And you discussed that with while you were on there, and one of the things you were talking about was whether early stage coaches actually have a philosophy or a set of beliefs or a set of principles, because actually at that stage of development sometimes that's just too much for people to think about. So if you haven't got a belief system, it's hard to then have that challenged, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And often it might be there, but it might just maybe not have been formalized, or maybe coaches haven't maybe thought about it. So often I find with novice coaches, the most common practice I see is the practice that they've experienced as a player. So we're recycling stuff that we've always done without really picking holes in it or challenging it. And I can give you an example of that. So I was a bit of a mischief to a coach we had on a level one. We set up a practice, and it was a practice that you'll have seen many times up and down the country, a circle of so maybe 4 players with a ball on the outside and 2 defenders, if you like, in the middle.
The world famous rondo.
That's the one, yeah. And so I went in the middle. It was cold, and I thought I might need to warm up. And I asked the coach, what do we do if we win the ball? And the instruction was, give it them back. So I thought, okay. And I didn't want to challenge any further. I said, how do I get out of the middle? How do I stop being the defender? He said, well, you'll do a minute. Okay. And so what's their task? Well, their task is to try and pass the ball between you two. Okay. Ready? Go. And what I did was I just grabbed the other defender with me and just stood side by side in the middle and waited. And I could see this poor coach getting really frustrated, and he didn't know what to do. But I wanted to make a point that that's if I win the ball, if I work really hard to win the ball back in the game, the last thing that he would want me to do in the match is to give it back to the opposition. So, but I said, so we stood there, and he was getting frustrated, and I said, look, in the match, if your players are outnumbered 2 versus 4, would you want them to go chasing around like rabbits and trying to win the ball, or would you want them to think, intelligently and play intelligently? Okay. So now we've got, a platform from where we can have a discussion and a conversation about it. So, and it came back to, I think it was something that you'd said a while ago in one of your episodes was, what is this game asking me to do? And actually, the way that practice was framed is that practice was asking me not to let the other team put the ball between us, and if I waited for a minute, then I would become the attacker. So there was no actual incentive, but I asked him where did he get that from, and that was something that he'd done as a player. And so that's often what I find novice coaches will start from is right, what did I do? What were the things that I enjoyed, or what did we just do? Okay, that'll be my starting point. Let's go from there. And the sooner we can get coaches maybe challenging that notion and starting to think differently, then I think it can help in the long term.
Yeah, and I think it's definitely, I think that you're right, and I think so. Rather than necessarily having a rationale, which is, I mean, for me, that should be the fundamental question when we're considering what to do in any session. It shouldn't be about just thinking of an activity or thinking of a drill, and it always makes me laugh when I see online, get this drill, get that drill, get the other drill, and I think people just think, oh, I've got an activity to do. Brilliant. That activity, and the assumption then is that the activity is valuable in itself. And it is, in the sense that, there's movement, there's all that sort of stuff. But it should always be related to what is the game problem that we're trying to solve. And the game itself, I mean, I'm involved, as you know, in hockey, you're involved in football, but ostensibly they're the same game, one played with a stick, one played with feet. We use, and in those things, what those games are asking us to do are quite simple. You've got to try and either move the ball to get closer to the goal, you've got to move with the ball to get closer to the goal, and there's going to be some people who are going to try and stop you, and the way they're going to try and stop you is to either get in your way, take the ball away from you. These are pretty simple game problems to solve, and so our sessions always need to be based on those problems. And we should design things based on combinations of those problems. Either, let's say, combining two together. For example, let's combine carrying the ball and somebody trying to stop you. So we'd be in a tackling scenario. Or actually, we're just going to go do something about carrying the ball, running with the ball. That's fine. Let's think about doing something around carrying the ball, but let's make it as contextualized as we possibly can. So for me, that's what that's the sort of starting point in terms of a philosophy, is actually basing everything coming out of the game. I know there's lots more we could talk about on that. But I think you asking that question is that starting point of that learning journey, isn't it, for somebody? Because they're thinking, oh, what am I doing here? What am I trying to do? So you're what Rick Shuttleworth calls creating safe uncertainty.
Yeah, and I think going back, the bigger question, I suppose, is why am I doing here? So what games or practices and getting hung up on games and practices, what is the reason you're actually coaching for? What's the bigger picture stuff? So the club I volunteer at, we tried to kind of formalize this a few years ago now and really drill down into the reasons why we as a club exist. And so one of the things we did was surveyed. We set up a Google survey and sent it out to every player, parent, coach, committee member. So that was about, I think, 300 plus people in the club. We got a fair amount of teams. So we had about 300 responses, and we asked them. It was anonymous, but we asked them several questions to try and get some greater understanding. And one of the questions was, why are you involved with our club? And another was, sum up the club in 3 words. And what we did was we took all the responses from those answers and we copied and pasted them into a word cloud generator. I don't know if you've seen those word cloud things. And I had to double check it and run it through again because I wasn't quite sure if what I was seeing was true. And I checked it again. Well, basically we had the result was this huge word cloud and 3, so we had hundreds of small font words and then 3 words which were just huge and stuck out more than the rest of them, which was fun, friendly and fair. So, and we thought, that's, if we're talking about, other context in which I coach and develop coaches in, which is grassroots, they're not bad values or principles to hang a hat on. So every action that we take, we should be asking ourselves, does it align with fun, friendly and fair? Now, for a coach in a performance or an elite or a professional environment, that might be different. But for us in our environment, in grassroots, fun, friendly, fair, the fact that they even begin with the same letter kind of helps to to formalise that. So we've kind of adopted that as our club values. And anytime that we're faced with a problem, and we're no means perfect, by the way, as a club. We still make mistakes, we still get things wrong, but that's our guide, that's our barometer. Is what we're doing, are the decisions we're making, either as an individual coach or as a wider club, do they align with fun, friendly, and fair?
So that's sort of. I think I've talked about this before, but when I'm doing Coach Ed with England Hockey, we talk about the golden thread. And there's 5 things in England Hockey, and the golden thread is it's got to be fun. There's got to be decisions to be made. There's got to be lots of touches of the ball. It's got to be something like a game, and there's got to be an element of stretch. I'm actually really, really pleased I remembered all 5. I can never normally remember all 5. Yeah. But that's like a golden thread for you, isn't it? That's that's the central pillar around which, you'll do lots of other things, but ultimately you're always going to come back to, is what we're doing here fun, friendly, fair? Are we acting in a fun, friendly, fair way?
Yeah. And like I said, we're never going to be perfect. We're dealing with human beings here, and that's one thing that I think that some coaches sometimes struggle with, is they'll come up with these statements or these values, and they are completely hamstrung by them. They're almost there's no maneuver, there's no degree of freedom. But with these 3, with our value statements, fun, friendly, fair, it's something from which we can start to assess ourselves against. So to what extent has our practice aligned with this, both in training and on a match day?
And so I suppose then, like on a match day, like a good friend of mine who I've spoken about in the past, who was sort of faced with this moral dilemma on the sideline with a young player who hadn't played any minutes up to that point, and coming towards the last 10 minutes of the game, and probably bring him on and then score a goal, and maybe we won't. So with that scenario, you're saying, well, it's not fun for the individual. We're not being particularly friendly to them, and it's certainly not fair. So actually, that's going to guide the way we react with substitutions and game time, I assume.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I've been one who's talked about game time and on a match day quite extensively with coaches that I work with, and I know Nick, who you've had on before, is another advocate of this around. These parents and players pay to play, and actually, we're here to serve. It's not the other way around. So I've often used a playing time formula that I generated a few years ago. That having a kind of physics background, I strive for things in black and white, but I know that we work in the grey most of the time. So I wanted to know, well. Often I've no idea of who's going to turn up, of how many players we're going to have. You're always going to get players who are late or injured. That's just the nature of grassroots. So I needed a system to let me know how I could quickly work out just before kick-off what equal playing time was. So I did that. And now I find, rather than just going purely to the second, which I would have done in the past, I recognise now that over the long term, generally the players will get an equal number of minutes. I try to get them an equal number of exposure across the different positions. And again, that's opened another can of worms, is, when do you start to nail down positions? Well, without hiding behind it, it does depend, I suppose.
but what does it depend on?
Well, I mean, we're lucky in football that you can be almost any shape or size and be effective at the game. I'm 5'10". I'm probably not going to play in the NBA anytime soon. But again, it's that.
Have you seen Isaiah Thomas, by the way?
I have, and I did play basketball for quite a while at high school, but my skills are nowhere near his, and I'd likely never to be either.
Yeah, so the issue might not necessarily be height; it might be athleticism, perhaps.
Yeah, it could be, and actually, it's very much so in my case. But yeah, with the players, it's really just trying to, I suppose, give them as broad a skill set as they can. Once they've gone through that adolescent growth spurt, they're in the best possible position to be able to react and adapt to the situations in which they find themselves, which is what the game demands. So, football, as hockey, is we call it a late specialisation sport. So we don't actually reach our peak until roughly mid to late 20s, in some positions, goalkeeper, for example, that might be beyond that. Yet we make decisions on them, or we lock them into positions over a decade before that. And I think that's something that we need to challenge a bit more.
Because if you're big when you're young, and it means you've got a physical advantage over somebody else, and so, for example, you put you at centre half because you can head the ball and this, that, and the other when you're 10 years old. But then if you don't grow a great deal more, which a lot of kids don't, tall poppies they call them, don't they? So you tap out at 5'10", but if you were 5'10" at 11, but you don't get any bigger, but then you get streamed into different positions, and then all of a sudden that's all you've ever known, and then you're kind of left behind, aren't you?
Yeah, and I grew up on the Isle of Man playing for a community club, and I was the taller, fatter one who couldn't really run much, but I would stick my head on the ball. And so this was back in the day where under 10s we would play football on the same size, on the same pitch that our first team would play on the afternoon. And we were a team of giants. We really had some athletes, and our age group was two-year age band. So we often played with the year above. So I didn't actually learn how to defend in football by playing football. Everything I know about defending, I'll say everything, most of what I know about defending in the game of football came from playing basketball at high school. And the reason being is I would be stuck at centre half, and we would steamroll most teams. And there would be times where in a 30-minute half, as a youth footballer, I would never be faced with a 1v1. Or the ball would rarely come into our half. So I wasn't actually learning much about the game as a player by playing that game, because the repetition was so low. Playing basketball, however, you look at the rules of that game, it was very much thinking about time, space, where's the player that I'm marking, where's the ball, and what's the relation of those two to the basket. And I need to make sure that both of those are in my field of view. And so those principles, talked about the similarities between hockey and football. Those invasion game principles that really travel across. I think that, for me in my own development as a player, albeit a very limited one, that was my learning journey.
Yeah, and I think that's often overlooked, isn't it? Is people often talk about complementary sports, or they're now talking about donor sports. Have you heard this term? So this is where you almost like you're deliberately engineering that a child plays other sports that are going to complement or act as a means by which their main sport they'll get better at. So already it's a specialization mindset. They've got a main sport, whether they like it or not, and we're going to do other sports in order to help them be better at their main sports. Well, hang on a second. That's the wrong way to look at it for a kickoff. Actually, the idea is do all these different sports for the love of those sports. Now, the fact that they actually provide significant benefit for one to the other, that's a byproduct. But people are thinking about it much more systematically. And the donor sport concept is the idea that some sports are deliberately going, that sport over there could be a donor sport to us. And so we're going to stay close to them so that when kids drop out of their system, we'll hoover them up into our pathway.
Yeah, I can see what you mean by that. And it is a worry. It's almost becoming a race to the bottom. And even in, we have this situation in grassroots where I ran a pre-season training workshop a couple of summers ago. Again, trying to challenge some of the ideas or the traditional practice around pre-season training. And I asked, just trying to get a feel of the room, who have we got there? So we had some adult male and female coaches. We had a coach who was an under threes coach, which was a worry. And then I said, well, you're at a pre-season training workshop and you work with under threes, and yeah, that was a bit of a worry, that one. I'll be honest.
I can't. Well, firstly, the very fact they're called under threes. I mean, the only reason you would call them under threes is if you were in some sort of competition format, and you don't do that with 3-year-olds, surely. That's got to be a soccer tots thing, surely, or something like that.
Yes, I think it was, and I'm sure that, hopefully the coach had the best of intentions and was coming in with fresh ideas or just to gain some knowledge, and that's great. But I think it is something that is a bit of a worry that we go so sport specific so early, rather than looking at what are the what are the general skills and abilities that we could try and help these young people to develop in order for them to have a platform from which to develop within their sport. So I have a nephew, and his dad has started taking him to football. He's only just turned 4, and I've been banging on for years now. I said, don't go to football yet. Take him to gymnastics. Let him build up a physical base. And you watch how he'll thrive from that point if he has some good exposure in a high quality gymnastics environment. And no, has he listened to me? Not at all. He's going to play for Liverpool.
Yeah, and you got the earlier you start, the better. I mean, do you know, it's funny though, isn't it? Because in all seriousness, I think this is one of our biggest challenges. Is I wonder whether rationality, so this rational argument we're having now, this rational discussion, where we're articulating, essentially this idea that very logically, go and do other things, do gymnastics, this, that, or the other. Don't do football yet because they're not really ready. Wait for the right time. But I'm convinced that some people, whether they admit it or not, I don't think those rational arguments get through. If you look at Dan Ariely and Predictably Irrational and all of the stuff around decision making that Kahneman and Tversky have talked about, and I'm sure that we as humans, we do these things, and I think deep down inside there's a driver, and I'm trying to unlock what that driver is.
Yeah, I know where you're coming from there, and actually on my little mind map that I was writing out before we started, that Kahneman and Ariely's work was something that I'd put down here, because people do make irrational decisions. I think reading all of Dan Ariely's work, I actually took one of his online MOOCs as well. I don't know if you saw that through Duke University. That was really interesting. Understanding more about why people behave the way that they do and why they make decisions the way that they do. It's helped me to understand coaches and parents that little bit better. One of the things that Ariely spoke about was the IKEA effect, and I see this so often in practice where a coach will send me a session plan, for example, and ask me for feedback. So I would say I don't have many strengths, but one of them might be the amount of practices or that I've been exposed to in my time of developing coaches. I've probably got an eye for what might work or what might be a hindrance in practice. So I'll give some feedback or maybe offer some suggestions or say, here's some ways in which the players might play the game that you might not have thought about. But then the coach will often still deliver the practice verbatim as planned out on the session. And it's that, it doesn't look that looks great. And it's that, I think he called it the IKEA effect, because when you go to IKEA and you get a wardrobe or a chest of drawers, because you've spent that much time and effort in building them, you value them to be of greater, or you value them greater than maybe an outsider would looking at them. So that was an interesting one. The other one was this notion of regression to the mean. Again, and this is something I think we need to think more about, or get away from this kind of reductionist, simplistic thinking. So I think it was the pilot study where the Air Force pilots were given positive or negative feedback, and what they found was that when the pilots were given negative feedback, their performance improved, and positive feedback was their performance deteriorated. But actually, it wasn't the feedback that was having the impact. The pilot's performance was just regressing back to the mean. And so sometimes you'll see a player might have a good game, for example, and so the coach might attribute that to something that he or she has done, or a practice or a drill that they have set up, and solely think about, the players learn because of this single thing or this single action or this single practice has caused this player to learn X, and maybe ignoring or dismissing all the other things that have come into play that might have led to that point?
Yeah, we're very quick, aren't we, to attribute causality to our activities, and I'm really guilty of this actually, and it's something that I'm sort of wrestling with a little bit at the moment, which is I believe, because obviously I've got this group of children that I coach, and I've obviously got a couple of little ones myself, and I have a fundamental sort of starting point around young people's development in sport, which is largely grounded from an ecological standpoint. And so a lot of what I'm doing with young people is allowing them to explore, allowing them to develop, allowing them to be creative, creating environments where they're creative. And I genuinely believe that that's the best way for them to learn and develop. And I believe that I see that. I see the results. I'm seeing it. I'm seeing players do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. But that could just be enormous confirmation bias, couldn't it? Because I'm looking for it. I'm looking for examples of it. I'm ignoring all the examples where it might not be happening. So, for example, quite a lot of players who haven't really got some of the sort of fundamental technical abilities that others in other contexts do. And I'm like, well, probably sort of ignoring that because I'm looking at the little ones that are actually showing me examples of what I believe to be the case. But that could just be because they have that within them. It might be nothing to do with my methods.
Yeah, it's like I think was it the analogy of the drunk man who, or the man walking home from the pub and he finds a drunk man crawling under the streetlight. He said, "What are you doing there?" He said, "Well, I've lost my watch." He said, "Where do you lose it?" "I'm not sure, but this is the only place that I can see." So we look for things only where we think we can find the truth, if you like.
Yeah, it's a really good analogy. It's one of those things, where, but I mean, having said that about around the confirmation bias side of things, at the same time, I think, being aware of that and understanding that and constantly questioning yourself in that way, I think I believe anyway, is one of the things that helps to drive our improvement. And it's the questioning piece that it goes back to what you were saying at the start around is almost being. The secret here is to be unsure. Yeah,
definitely, and I've, it keeps me awake quite a lot at night. And instead of wrestling with it now, what I've learned to do is just keep a notepad by the side of the bed and just jot stuff down as it comes in, because it literally has, kept me awake at times, questioning why I'm doing it, why I'm doing what I'm doing. Is there a better way? And really being quite self-critical, but that's the nature of who I am. I'm not saying I'm a good coach by any means, but I am comfortable with that being uncomfortable, if you like.
Yeah, and it's what drives us to search for new answers and search to improve all the time.
Yeah, it's an important process to go through.
So with the work you do, I mean, you've mentioned on a number of occasions that you're obviously seeing a lot of coaches, you see a lot of session plans. All these sorts of things. What do you see sort of, day to day that sort of almost like keeps cropping up and kind of vexes you and makes you think we need to tackle that somehow?
I suppose that unwillingness to let go of things that we've done in the past or that we've always done. That would be within the coaching practice. So just you've talked about the drill based stuff before, and I know you've talked extensively about that. I think that's something that we, if you look at the way that the game is played, or generally invasion games, the order of events is that the decision occurs before the action. But we try to teach it the other way around. So I came across a brilliant book by one of my old lecturers, actually, Thorpe and Bunker, called Rethinking Games Teaching. This was years ago now, and I think it was written in the 70s or 80s, and it's timeless. Really recommend coaches look into that if they haven't already. And it was that we've got this thing maybe the wrong way round. So that would be one, is that actually returns from practice. What do you get? What don't you get? And looking into that.
So bring that to life for me, in terms of, I mean, I like that quote, by the way. You might just have titled the podcast right there. The decision comes before the action, but we teach it the other way around. So give me an example of that, sort of bring that to life for me.
Yeah, so if you look at, let's take something like dribbling. So a traditional way that we might teach that is everyone has a ball, and they might be in lines. Go and dribble around those cones. The cones don't generally move unless it's me and you kick them. But yeah, we might teach dribbling that way, or we might start to bring that into a bit more of a variable practice with some interference. Okay, try not to bump into anyone and so on. And so the players might get quite good at dribbling with the ball, but in the game, in order to dribble with the ball, they need to first find space in which to receive the ball. And so we've taught this, we've isolated this thing called dribbling, but we haven't actually looked at what's the bit that precedes that, and how do we get ourselves into a position where we can get the ball in order for us to dribble. So that's something, a really, I suppose, a simple example of that is thinking about the before, the during, and the after. So for example, tennis is another example. So a tennis coach will often, with a beginner, will drop the ball vertically in order for the player to hit the ball across the net. Well, I haven't seen too many balls come down in a tennis match from a vertical position. So what's the before of maybe a forehand? Well, it might come from a serve, or often it'll come. You start the point from a serve. So how often do we break it down and think about, okay, what's the thing that we're trying to practice? Okay, what might happen in the game before that, and then what might happen after we've executed that skill or technique? So,
what I'm tempted to sort of challenge that, but I'm not going to challenge it because I'm trying to challenge it just for the sake of sort of playing devil's advocate. Because I think one of the problems a lot of people have is if you, and this is what I hear a lot from people, which is, yeah, but hang on, if you can't move with the ball, and you can't change direction with the ball, and you can't control the ball, then you can't play the game. And so you need to learn to do that before you can play the game. I'm not saying I agree with this. This is what I hear a lot. But also, I sort of understand to a certain extent why people think this, because when you're playing a game, there's too much chaos. There's too many things going on. And so the alternative danger is that you never learn to manipulate the ball in any kind of fully creative way, because all you're doing is constantly trying to deal with all the chaos of people running and challenging you. So how do you explain that to an individual where you're sort of having this conversation with them to say that the isolation model, the reductionist isolation approach, there's an alternative way? So what do you give them that can kind of show them the alternative? I
suppose when you're looking at often I find it's most effective when the coach can see it brought to life with the players that he or she is working with. So traditionally on coaching courses, as you know, we've got a group of adults who will generally behave and do what you want for each other. The way that we're starting to move our coach education model now within the FA is a lot more of us going out and working with coaches individually in their own environment. So once they can see how or the response that they get from their own players, I think that can be quite a motivating and powerful factor for the coaches. So I know you've talked at length with other people on the podcast around, for example, the constraints-based approach, which is something that, without necessarily labeling it that as such, which might put some coaches off, get them to think about some of these things that they're probably already doing anyway, and how they would manifest. An example would be, which is a common one, everyone must touch the ball before you score. So this is very common practice. I'm sure it comes out in hockey. The realism is that that's not often the case. So how do we find a balance between that? Because if I know that you're the last person who hasn't touched the ball yet, I'm not going to bother defending the ball. All we'll do is swarm you and make sure that you can't get the ball. So let's look at balancing that off and try to reward the sort of play that we're after, because it's done with the best of intentions. Coaches, for example, they want their players to share the ball around and play that sort of attractive football that they might have seen on the TV. But it's not exactly easy in reality. So how can we reward it? Okay, so the more players that are involved in your move, the more goals that you score. So if you receive the ball, Stuart, and you're in front of goal, the last thing I would want you to do in the match is turn around and look to pass it to somebody when you've got an open goal. So put it in the goal. But it's up to you then to make the decision. And I think that's one thing that we're trying to get coaches to understand more of, is that balance between repetition and realism, and looking at what the trade-offs are and what you get and what you don't get, and how often we'll get unintended consequences out of the conditions that we might impose on our players or our practices.
Absolutely. So, if you, going back to the example you gave at the start, though, around, like, say, something as sort of fairly fundamental as dribbling, in that context, if you were going to sort of, I suppose, take a young player and expose them to ball manipulation, a ball manipulation activity of some kind, what would it look like so you were doing it in a more contextualized way and not in an isolated way?
Okay, so one of the things I see quite often is we tend to go up the steps, if you like, when we try to teach the players skills. And what I mean by this is, right, your team versus my team. Your team are trying to keep the ball off my team. Okay, let's say it's 4v4, for example. And a coach might put a condition on my team that we can't tackle, we can only get in the way. And that is something that I try and challenge coaches about, because it's not what they would do in the game. So the intention is that the coach wants to slow my team down in order to give you guys a chance to get more repetition or more time on the ball. So an example might be, okay, instead of just having them shadow and get in the way, give them a ball and make them block with the ball. So give me and all my team a ball, and the deal is, all we've got to do is tag one of you in possession. But in order for the tag to count, I've got to have my ball at my feet. Okay, so if you think about that from a ball manipulation perspective, if you look at the way that, or what the game demands, it's that perception, it's making a decision and then acting on it. So if some of the things we try to get players to do when they dribble the ball is keep your head up. Yeah. So without actually telling the players to keep their head up, for me to have any sort of success of tagging anyone on your team, I've got to know where you are and where the ball is. So the practice, going back to what you said before, what is the game asking me to do? The game is asking me to keep the ball close to me and keep my head up and respond and react and adapt and predict to what your team are doing. And so that's an example of a way that we might include sort of those ball manipulation activities, but within sort of some sort of kind of game realistic environment. Because I see a lot of coaches who there's ball manipulation stuff out there, and it's the perception, if you like, is completely removed, and they look fantastic. It looks like kind of a really nicely choreographed dance a lot of the time, but I see the head down, and I see no kind of appreciation for time and space and threat and opposition, which is the opposite of actually what we want them to do in the match.
So they're essentially learning a movement that is in no way representative of the movement that they're likely to have to perform in a game context. And then these same coaches are the same coaches who get frustrated when the player can't perform the action that they look for. Well, it's not their fault. They haven't trained the action.
Yeah, That's it. And so breaking it down once more, let's say I'm the tagger and you and a partner are trying to keep the ball. Okay. But I've got to tag either of you, whichever one of you has the ball, and keep my ball at me. Well, think of the things that I've got to do in order to be successful at that game. I've got to see where you are. I've got to see where the ball is. I've got to move my ball. I've got to manipulate it in different ways. But the way in which I manipulate the ball will be dependent on what you and your partner are doing. So I'm taking that information in off the both of you. And by the way, if I suddenly look down at the ball, I'm out of the game for a moment. So I've got to, for as long as I can, keep you, your partner, the ball in my field of view whilst manipulating my own ball. And I've done this with 6-year-olds, and watching the way that they cope and the way that they respond and react and adapt to what's being asked of them is absolutely fascinating.
I've just talking about the head up thing. I just saw something this morning on Twitter. Somebody tagged me on a post. And, I've been talking about the use of clickers recently to keep score,
yeah.
Right? Well, the latest thing that I've seen, and actually it's a brilliant idea and I'm definitely going to use it, is headbands.
Yes, as instead of bibs.
Instead of bibs.
Yeah.
So
I think I heard you speaking about that before, yeah.
Yeah, it's a brilliant equipment constraint, isn't it? Because, if anything's going to keep your head up, looking for your teammates by having the actual colour coding head height.
Yeah.
Because it's quite an interesting idea, actually. So, that one's definitely coming out fairly soon. We're going to have all of my players in these bright neon headbands, looking like they're going to go to some sort of 80s rave.
Buy some shares. But then there's the argument of we'll try playing with no bibs, and see if the players can pick out each other through their body language, the way that they're facing. Don't do what I did on the A license that Nick and I were on the other day, where I was in a centre half position. I got the ball from my other centre half, didn't look behind me, and I heard a shout of over. So I let the ball go, thinking it was my right back, and it wasn't. It was our friend Mr. Levitt, who was playing on the opposite team, who ran in and made me look a complete idiot.
Well, if there's one thing that Nick can do, is he can make you look like a complete idiot.
Yeah, he's good at that.
So just drilling back to this, going back to that, before we go off it too much. So for example, I one of the things I think is a big challenge is, and I think this is what actually sort of stimulates some of the drills games debate, is I think people think the opposite of a drill is a 4v4. They think the next step is a 4v4 and kids should just be playing games. And in fact, Rod Thorpe himself has said to me that, kids doing drills isn't very good, but kids doing games isn't much better. So if all they do is play games, don't get me wrong, that is definitely a better experience, and they will, I think, develop because they're going to develop naturally. But actually, if we can guide some of those games, then that's better. So the jump people go from isolated skill practice, it's not that, it's therefore this. So it's very, very kind of dichotomous argument. What I'm saying is that in every one of my sessions, there's some me and my ball time. Of course there is. You've got to have an opportunity to manipulate the ball. But we're always trying to do it with some form of perceptual cue, acting as the means by which we move the ball. So, for example, we do a lot of, you must do this, you must do truck and trailer.
Yeah, I know what you mean by that, yeah.
Yeah, where basically one player's got a ball, they're running with it, and the other player's trying to follow them with a ball as well. And the person in front tries to get away. Well, I've changed it, so we've got a new one, which is called Rockets and Spaceships, where the rocket has to go really fast, or as fast as possible, and the spaceship has to stay close. And then the other one we've created is Dogfight, where the idea is a bit like you were talking about there, is one's trying to get away and the other person is trying to tag the other person with the ball, but under control. I call it Dogfight, same sort of thing. But this is all about the idea of the person in front is the person that is going to determine how I move. And that's a massively different thing than trying to dribble around a set of cones that never move.
Yeah, and because they have those, you have to, there's perceptual skills of reacting, adapting and predicting, which are absolutely crucial if we're going to develop good games players. It was interesting that actually, I think it was the TGFU conference was in Loughborough back in, I think, 2012. And I went along, and I can't remember for the life of me who delivered the session now. But basically set up 4 games across a sports hall at Loughborough. One was hockey, one was handball, one was football, and one was basketball. And we played 4 versus 4 games for a couple of hours in the afternoon, with just exploring what the different games were asking us to do. All invasion games was the common theme. And our team, we played against a team with a German girl in it, and she was a professional basketball player from in the German basketball league. She'd never played football before in her life, and yet she was the best player on the 4v4 football. And the reason being was her understanding of time and space, and her ability to predict what was going on before it happened, meant that she didn't need to have to be technically good, because she was already in the right position, which gave her so much more time than anybody else playing the game. And I'm not saying, oh well, that means throw out technique. Technique's not important. No, absolutely it is. But if we can teach them to understand that time and space, then it will allow them even more time to be able to pose the opposition even more difficulty. And it was really interesting in each of the 4 games. Obviously, basketball, she was streets ahead of the rest of us. But the rest of the games, she just always seemed to be in the right position at the right time, and it opened my eyes a lot to the way that we teach this game.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? Because your point earlier about we're not going to throw out technique. No, we're not going to throw out technique. What we're going to do is we're going to develop technique in relation to the player's desire to solve the problem. So it goes back to your point about sort of developing coaches in the context. You're helping them solve the problems that are presented to them. And likewise with the players, they go, hang on a second, I can't solve this problem. Okay, so now we can explore with you different ways, as opposed to the other way around you described, which is I'm going to give you a series of movements that you're probably going to need in this game at some point, and then it'll be up to you to work out the best ways of applying those. It's a more powerful learning model to allow technique to be a response to a problem. The player is massively motivated and driven to try and master that technique because they know it's a problem that they've solved and they want to not have to encounter that problem again.
Yeah, it's. I agree, and you've only got to watch. Watch Match of the Day and have a look at the different types of, especially one-touch finishes that players in order to get the ball in the net. And often, well, they are responsive, they're adaptive, and they're having to manipulate their body in different ways, often in ways in which I would argue they've probably rarely practiced in isolation. And yeah, I mean, just by watching the way in which, the ball ends up in the net often on a Saturday afternoon, you'll see many examples of that.
Am I right in thinking that Zlatan Ibrahimovic, didn't he play another sport for quite a long time?
I think he was quite a high-level martial artist, and which, when you look at the way that he can manipulate his body, it's no surprise really.
But again, the ability to in that context as well. I mean, the ability to adapt, and very rarely. You're not. It's the beauty of the game, isn't it? Is that you're rarely going to see the same thing over and over again. So on each occasion, it's the person with the ability to take whatever's happening in front of them and then adapt and create a solution. That's what marks out the difference, isn't it? But the first thing is the game appreciation, and I'm a firm believer in this. I think actually limiting technical capability actually forces people to have game appreciation, because if you haven't got the tools, you've got to work out what to do and work out, because obviously a lot of what we're about is about cohesion. It's about collective decision making. I think when we develop technique in young people, particularly because they're generally kids are quite self-centered anyway, aren't they? So all they want to do is that. Nothing wrong with that. But actually, if they can understand actually that one of the ways to solve this problem is I've got a load of friends here who can help me achieve our goal, then they start from that position. So now we understand that collectively, if we move in this way, we can perform better together. And then individually, as their techniques begin to improve, they start to understand they've all got relative strengths, and they actually begin to use those relative strengths. And that's something again, confirmation bias alert, but I genuinely think I see that. I see players with limited technical capabilities, but connecting together as teammates. And I feel strongly that as they develop as a group, they'll have an advantage over others because they have that game understanding.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a colleague of mine, Callum Munuruk, who at a conference recently was talking about, well, a coach asked him the question of, how do I get the player who won't pass to pass? And rather than fighting it and trying to force him or her to pass the ball, which, let's face it, in young developing players, players of that age, primary school age, not many of them share their toys. And often, in our case, a football is their favourite toy, so don't always expect them to share it. And what Callum said was, instead of tearing your hair out trying to get them to pass, set up game conditions in your practices that make it more and more difficult for him to dribble, so that he has to then pass. So instead of playing 1 versus 1, play him 1 versus 3. And ramp up the challenge to a point where he appreciates that he has to use his teammates in order to be successful. And I think that getting that education across or getting that point across to coaches, who then can get these messages across to the parents, is really important.
Yeah. So because I think generally speaking, what the default people we use as coaches is communication as a means by which to convey a message. So we tell them pass, no, pass, no, or in the game context, they're just not aware enough of anybody else around them to want to pass the ball to, so they're just going to carry it because that's given them some success in the past. Fine, I get it. The point being, though, is that if you change the environment, such, i.e., you either put task constraints in place, or you change the rules, or you change the space that they can operate in, then adaptations take place.
Yeah, and sorry, go on.
No, not always, and sometimes what we have to do is help to raise their awareness and perception in order to understand how to solve the problem. But more often than not, it's the change of the environment that brings about the human adaptation.
Yeah, and that you said about the communication thing. That's something that I see adults in youth sport get really frustrated with. So these young people are learners; they're learning the game. So one of the questions I pose is, think back to your first driving lesson. If somebody, could you hold a conversation with somebody or communicate with somebody effectively in the passenger seat when you were learning to drive? No, because you've got so much information and stimuli coming at you that you're completely focused on that moment. And it's a little bit like when you are learning. We, as adults, we get frustrated because they're not talking, they're not communicating. Well, maybe because they've got so many things going on, they haven't got the mental capacity to be able to communicate with one another in that moment. And if you want to see an example of communication on a football field, for example, at the elite level, I urge coaches to go and watch Zidane, a 21st Century Portrait, which is, I don't know if you've heard of that. It was a filmmaker filmed Zinedine Zidane playing for Real Madrid, and it's just a player cam for 90 minutes. You'll be surprised at how long you'll watch it for. It's absolutely fascinating. I'm convinced that he doesn't say 2 words in the whole game. He literally doesn't say 2 words. But as one of the greatest players that's ever played the game, what he's exceptionally good at is being in the right place at the right time. And
communication, as you say, you must get this, when you're coaching, right? You ask a question, right? So what do we need to do to be successful here? Communication every time. It's every time, isn't it? Every coach in the country must experience this. And my kids have realised now that that's never a good question to ask me, because I then immediately will go, oh, tell me more about that. What about communication? What specifically we talk? And then they realise, that's not the thing to say, because then they're going to have to answer a load more questions. But often, when we talk about communication, actually they're right, but maybe not in the way they think. It isn't just about shouting stuff at each other. It isn't just about being loud, and it isn't just about making lots of noises, because you hear a lot of "yeah," don't you? Or "Dave," or "pass it." Just instructions. Actually, communication is, obviously takes many forms. So, one of the things I do quite a lot of is I play "Who My Ears." So that's a game where if anybody makes any noise, either the ball hitting the stick or they shout to each other to get a pass or something like that, I shout, "Ooh, my ears!" And then we might have to do some kind of crazy forfeit or something silly, or they lose a point or whatever it might be. And the reason for that is I want them to get used to playing in silence, and then to see how that compares to them when they're not playing in silence, and the value of not playing in silence, or what it is that they can understand from each other by playing in silence. So one of the things they start to do is they get visual connections with each other in order to make passes. And then interestingly enough, the passes get more accurate. So they're not just flinging the ball in someone's general direction. They're actually looking at them, making almost an agreement between each other that one person wants the ball, the other person doesn't. Oh, and actually you want it in that place. Oh, right, I'm going to give it there then. And it's quite interesting when you constrain a sense, how that brings about a different form of communication.
Yeah, I've seen that used quite a lot in football, and it really gets you to value that non-verbal communication. And so one of the boys that I'm looking up to coach, he has developed a really interesting way of using his hands and his wrists to show where he wants the ball. And his teammates have cottoned onto it now, and he's so effective. And I would say technically he's a really efficient player. Physically, he's one of the smallest, so you can read into that what you want. But he's developed this fantastic way of communicating non-verbally with his teammates, and they know every time exactly where he wants the ball.
And it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I remember I've got a couple of people I play with now who do that. They run one way, point the other way. It's just nothing like it.
Normally me.
So hey, listen, Jack, we've been banging on and agreeing the life out of each other as we do.
We need to be more critical.
Well, I was going to ask you that just before we sort of wrap up. You've got a few things on your list. Is there anything that you want to kind of take me to task on, or any kind of hot topics that you think are worth some good sort of critical debate?
Well, we could go on all day, so maybe for another time. But I think one of the things that, and this might not go down too well, but it's the drills games dichotomy and debate. I suppose it's one of the things I've relaxed on, and probably actually from listening to or from doing Don's interview with the Liverpool FA podcast when he was talking about, I think he told the story about going to see a coach who was very much a games-based advocate, and the first time he saw him, the first thing that this coach did was a relay drill. But what the way that the coach justified it was, I used that in order to get the players ready for me. It basically was unlocking the door for a great session, and so I've become a little bit more relaxed about that drill-like constant practice, which has had a bad name, I suppose, but understanding what its role is. If its role is to develop things that you can do it or get you better at playing the game, I understand that it's a limitation. It's probably not going to do that because you've like we said, you've removed the perception from the action. What I have noticed though is just watching, and again, this is purely from anecdotal from watching the players that I coach, is that just by spending 1 or 2 minutes when they've set it up, I've said, look, you take charge of the warm up while I go and set the area out, and they've set up a kind of rondo activity, and I've just watched them. I'm thinking, how do I deal with this? And then looking at the difference in how they've then approached the session just by spending a couple of minutes in a low context activity has got me to got my pendulum, if you like, to swing to a more balanced view without being so dogmatic about things. But yeah, like I said, can of worms there. It doesn't mean I'm not a games-based advocate. I well and truly am, but it's being a little bit more rational about things, I suppose.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just a couple of points on that. I was talking with Mark Upton. Hasn't been on the show yet, and is long overdue. But we're talking about this, and he was sort of saying that. And he said that we need to find another term. You used the word constraints-led. That can be alienating. We need to find a new term. He says that I'm not sure it's the right thing to call it. He says I'm not sure what to call it, but it's not that. I think games-based, I don't think that helps either because it conveys a certain thing and it might not be that thing. And There's lots of terms, non-linear pedagogy, all these sorts of different things going around. And actually, I don't think any of them are particularly good. So I think the search for, answers on a postcard, please, for the search for a better title. But I think the one thing I use the phrase is, you just use the phrase there, like you said, not so context heavy. So contextualized learning. And I sort of kind of agree with you that actually there's nothing wrong with a bit of, less contextualized, but this is why I use this phrase, what I call the funnel of variability. So, you've got high variability in the full game, and then you come right down to something that's isolated practice, and it's got significantly low variability. But what I say is I just hover above that low variability area. So just do something that's got a little bit of something in it. It doesn't have to be full on hardcore go at it. So quite often, a lot of the sessions I start with are just, there you go, there's one ball, there's two of you, off you go. Just chase each other around with a ball. Nothing wrong with that, And so those sorts of things, I think, have still got enormous value. I just think if I could eradicate the cue, and I could eradicate the cone, not the cone as a way of marking out space, but the cone as an area to move to dribble round. So eradicate the cone from that perspective. Eradicate the cue, eradicate the cone, and eradicate that purely isolated drill, in order to make people slightly more imaginative about those low context exercises. Not only do I think it's a better experience for kids, but I think they learn more from it too.
Yeah, I think that my biases come from the fact that the vast majority of the coaches that I work with, and indeed in my own practice, we have this hour. The facility that we've got 3,600 seconds, and we've got to try and squeeze the most out of every single one of them, because we only see them for that hour a week. And so I recognize that because of that time constraint, that's probably where my views around high repetition and almost constant practices have come from. But yeah, like you say, just being a little bit more thoughtful and a bit more balanced about what you get, what you don't get, and for what reason, and just like you say, can you start to think of adding in some sort of decision making? Might
absolutely
put us in a better place.
Right. Well,
you've got the dentist, haven't you?
Oh, blimey! I've forgotten that. I'm going to be in trouble already. Oh dear me! There you go. That was a constraint already. Reminder. Hey, listen, it's been a fantastic conversation, and if I get a toothache from it, then it's worth it every second.
I apologise.
No.
So I do ramble.
Nothing to do with you. I was rambling as much as you were. So, hey, listen, enjoyed every second, and like I said, we could definitely go on, and I'm sure we can come back to this in a period in a few months' time, and maybe sort of reflect on the conversation and pick up some other topics. In the meantime, you've got a podcast out. I know you're active on Twitter and various other places. So where can people find out more about what you're up to?
So Twitter at Jack Walton 1. Don't confuse it with the guy who was on X Factor a few years ago, who made my life an absolute living hell every Saturday night. Don't have someone your namesake get to the X Factor final. That's a good piece of advice I can give to anyone. Get me on there. The podcast that you mentioned, we've just started. Shameless plug. If you're a coach or a football coach, you want some more of this sort of stuff. It's called the Liverpool FA podcast. But I think what you've started here, Stuart, and what you're continuing to do is brilliant, and it's that kind of informal learning gap that the coaching community is really needed. I thank you for putting it out there and inspiring me and many more of us to do more, I suppose.
I'm only annoyed at myself for not doing it earlier, because like you, I've loved podcasts and I've always wanted to, but I just couldn't get myself to do it. But having plunged right in, I'm really regretting that I didn't do it a lot earlier.
No, I mean, the commitment that you've shown and the amount of episodes that you're churning out is fantastic. I look forward to it in my car journeys.
Well, I've missed a dental appointment, and often I'm doing various other things. But anyway, there we go. It's all worth it. Jack, appreciate your time, and thanks a lot for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Stuart. It's been great. I hope the listeners can take something from it.